Put in a little now, be patient, and compounding will quietly turn it into a fortune. That is the sentence nearly every American with a bank account has been handed at some point, from a parent, a coworker, a personal finance book, a 2-minute clip that ended with the word just. Just start. Start with $20. Start with whatever you have. Time in the market does the rest. And here is the uncomfortable part, stated plainly at the top so nothing is hidden. That advice is not a scam. It is not a lie invented to sell courses. For a specific kind of person, in a specific set of conditions, it has been exactly, mathematically true. People really did turn modest, steady contributions into 6-figure balances by doing almost nothing except waiting. So this is not a takedown of an idea that never worked. It is an examination of an idea that worked and then got repeated so many times to so many different people in so many different circumstances that it quietly stopped fitting most of the people now being told to follow it. Because there is a number that rarely gets mentioned next to the encouragement. Most people who start small quit. They open the account, they fund it, they feel the small pride of having finally begun, and within a few years the contributions slow, then stop, then the account gets cashed out for a car repair, or a move, or a bad month, and the whole thing resets to zero. Not because they were lazy, not because they lacked discipline in some moral sense. Something in the standard advice sets them up to quit, and almost nobody names it. That is the question this video is built around, and it will stay open until the end. If starting small always wins, if compounding really does the heavy lifting, why do most people who start small quit before it ever matters? Notice the phrase "before it ever matters." That is the crack this whole guide pries open. Compounding, the thing everyone points to, does almost nothing in the early years of a small account. Nothing meaningful. The graph that gets shown, the gentle curve bending sharply upward, is real, but the part that bends sharply is decades to the right of where a near-zero starter is actually standing. In the years the beginner actually lives through, the returns come from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the "just start" advice never mentions, because mentioning it would make the pitch less clean. Over the next stretch, the arithmetic gets laid out directly. The first 5 years of a small account, dollar by dollar, where the money actually grows and where it merely sits. What fees do to a balance too small to defend itself. Why the amount contributed each month matters far more, early on, than any rate of return a fund could realistically deliver. And the exact point, it is remarkably predictable, where most small starters give up and what it takes to survive past it. But before any of that, the advice deserves a fair hearing. It was not made up. It came from somewhere, it described something real, and there was a time when a small saver who simply started was genuinely, reliably rewarded for it. Understanding who those people were and what conditions made them right is where the honesty has to begin. The phrase "let compounding do the work" is older than most of the accounts it gets attached to. It didn't come from a viral clip or a robo-advisor's welcome screen. It came from a genuinely different financial world, and to see who it was built for, you have to walk back through how it arrived. Start in the post-war decades. Through much of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, an ordinary American saver had access to something that now sounds almost fictional: a passbook savings account paying steady interest, and later certificates of deposit and money market instruments paying more. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, short-term rates spiked into the double digits. Money market funds paid over 15% at the peak. A person did not need a brokerage account, a fund selection, or any tolerance for risk. Money left alone actually multiplied, on its own, in an insured account. That is the world the rule of thumb was born in. Save steadily, be patient, let it compound, was not motivational language then. It was a literal description of what a passbook did. Then the turning point. Two things shifted underneath the advice without changing the words on top of it. First, in 1978, a quiet clause in the tax code, section 401k, was interpreted in a way that let employers offer tax-deferred salary contributions. Through the 1980s, the workplace retirement account went from novelty to default. Second, interest rates began their long descent from those early 80s highs down toward, eventually, near zero. So the safe, do-nothing compounding vanished at almost the exact moment tens of millions of ordinary workers were handed their first investment account and told the old sentence, just start and let it grow. The advice survived the transition, the conditions did not. And here is the consequence that matters. The people for whom just start and wait worked most reliably were not near zero starters scraping together $20. They were workers with an employer match, a payroll deduction they never had to feel, and, crucially, decades of continuous rising contributions flowing in automatically. Consider the archetype, labeled plainly as a composite. A factory or office worker who joined a plan in the mid-1980s, contributed 6% of a growing salary every 2 weeks for 30 years, received a company match on top, and never once had to decide to invest after the first form was signed. That person did extraordinarily well. The account did grow into 6 figures, sometimes far more. But look closely at why. The heavy lifting in those first 15 years was not compounding on a small balance. It was the sheer volume of money entering the account, the worker's own contributions, plus the match, plus raises that lifted the contribution automatically. Compounding took over later once the balance was large enough that its own growth could rival a year of deposits. The story got told backward. Compounding got the credit for a result that contributions, matching, and automation had already built the foundation of. That backward retelling is how a rule that described payroll-fed accounts became advice aimed at people with no payroll deduction, no match, and a balance small enough that its annual growth wouldn't cover a tank of gas. So the loop worth holding onto is this. Was the advice to just start ever actually meant for someone starting from almost zero, with nothing feeding the account but willpower? The historical record suggests it wasn't. It was meant for people who had already solved the harder problem. The problem of getting money in, reliably, without deciding to, month after month for years. Which points at something the near-zero starter needs to hear before anything else. The savers the rule genuinely worked for all shared one specific thing. It wasn't discipline. And it wasn't a better fund. It was a structure that made quitting nearly impossible. And it is the exact thing the person starting from zero today almost never has. Someone will push back here, and the objection is fair, so it should be stated at full strength. The reply goes something like this. Plenty of people started with almost nothing and still ended up wealthy. The immigrant who arrived with $200. The graduate who opened a Roth with a single $50 transfer. The stories exist. They get told at dinner tables and in comment sections precisely because they are real. So who is anyone to say the advice doesn't fit a near-zero starter when near-zero starters demonstrably won? Take that objection seriously because inside it is a true thing worth protecting. Yes, people who began with a trivial balance have finished rich. That happens. It is not myth, and dismissing it would be its own kind of dishonesty. But look at what actually happened between the small beginning and the large ending, because the beginning is the part that gets remembered and the middle is the part that did the work. Consider a composite, labeled plainly as a composite, a blend of a common real trajectory, not a specific person. A woman opens a brokerage account at 26 with $50. 15 years later, the account holds $300,000. The headline writes itself. She started with $50, and that sentence, while technically accurate, hides everything that mattered. Because in year 2, she was contributing $400 a month. By year 6, after 2 promotions, she was putting in $900. Her employer matched the first 4% of a rising salary. Somewhere around year 4, she inherited $11,000 and left it in. The $50 was the anchor of a story, not the engine of a result. That is the pattern under nearly every started with nothing account that ends well. The small opening balance is real. It is also almost irrelevant to the outcome. What separated the winners was not that they started small. It was what started flowing in immediately afterward, and how reliably it kept flowing. So the objection is right about the past and wrong about the lesson. It proves that small starters can succeed. It does not prove that starting small is what made them succeed. Those are different claims, and the entire Just Start industry survives by blurring the line between them. Here is the rebuttal stated cleanly. the advice to just start was never really about the starting amount. It was shorthand, a compressed, encouraging way of saying, get the machine running so the contributions can begin. For the payroll-fed worker of the 1980s, and for the composite saver above, that shorthand was harmless, because the moment they started, a large and rising stream of money started with them. The starting balance and the contribution stream were fused, you couldn't separate them, so nobody tried. But strip the two apart, and the whole thing changes. Take a person today who genuinely has almost nothing, no employer match, no automatic payroll deduction, no inheritance waiting in year 4, a balance of $50, and a contribution of $50 a month, made by hand, by choice, in a month where $50 is a real sacrifice. For that person, just start is not shorthand for a flowing machine, it is the whole plan, there is nothing behind it. The starting amount and the contribution rate are both, for now, tiny, and there is no external structure quietly forcing them upward. This is the hidden condition. Every success story that just start points to had a second ingredient. The phrase never names. A reliable, growing inflow. The starter did not have to summon by willpower each month. The near-zero starter of today has the willpower and none of the structure. Same words, entirely different situation. The loop can close on this point. Was the advice to just start ever meant for someone starting from almost zero, with nothing feeding the account but their own resolve? No. It was meant for people whose starting was inseparable from their inflow. The advice is being handed to a population it was never engineered for, people for whom the starting amount is not an anchor to a stream, but the entire boat. Which raises an uncomfortable question about the math itself. If the inflow is what built those fortunes, then what exactly is a tiny balance actually doing in those first years? And how little might it really be growing? $50, invested and left alone, growing at 7% a year. That is the picture the encouragement rests on. Run it forward, honestly, with real numbers, because the numbers are where the picture starts to come apart. A near-zero starter puts in $50 to open the account, then adds $50 a month by hand. No match, no payroll deduction, willpower alone. Assume a steady 7% annual return, which is generous for a beginner still learning to hold through a downturn. Watch what each part of the balance actually does. In year 1, the contributions total $650, the opening 50 plus 12 monthly 50s. And the growth? The celebrated compounding, the thing the whole story is built around? Roughly $24. 24. Over an entire year, the market's return on this account produced less than a single monthly contribution. Not half of one. Less than one. Now sit with what that $24 hides. It hides the fact that at this balance the return is not an engine. It is a rounding error attached to the side of the contributions. The graph everyone shows, the curve bending sharply upward, is genuinely real, but the sharp bend lives decades to the right of where this person is standing. Here, at the far left of that curve, the line is almost flat, because there is nothing for the 7% to work on yet. Keep going, because year 1 might be dismissed as just the beginning. By the end of year 3, the same $50 a month saver has contributed about $1,850 of their own money. The total account sits near $2,000. The market's cumulative contribution after 3 full years of patience is roughly $150. 3 years of holding, 3 years of discipline, 3 years of doing exactly what the advice prescribed, and growth has added about what 2.5 monthly contributions added. By year 5, the pattern hardens instead of breaking. Total contributed around $3,050. Total balance a little over $3,600. Growth share of the account after half a decade is somewhere near $600, and the saver produced 5 times that with their own hands. Recalculate what is actually happening in these years. For the first 5 years of a small account, the balance is not being built by returns. It is being built almost entirely by the act of contributing. The saver is the engine. The market is a passenger contributing loose change from the back seat. Every dollar of that balance that matters got there because someone decided 12 times a year to move $50 they could have spent. This is the arithmetic that Just Start framing quietly skips. It points at compounding, at the return, the rate, the fund, the 7%, As if that were the lever a beginner should obsess over. But the return is doing almost nothing yet. Choosing a fund that returns 8% instead of 6%, at this balance, changes the year one outcome by a few dollars. Choosing to contribute $70 a month instead of $50 changes it by $240. The gap is not close. Notice what that reveals about where a beginner's attention gets aimed. Every hour spent agonizing over which index fund, which platform, which allocation, is an hour spent optimizing the passenger while ignoring the engine. The advice trains the small starter to watch the one variable that cannot move the needle yet, and to take for granted the one variable doing all the work. The historical winners never had to notice this, because their inflow was automatic and large. It hid the flat years. For the person contributing by hand, there is no hiding. The flat years are the years they actually live in. The years where the return they were promised does not show up in any amount they can feel. Which forces a harder conclusion than be patient. If growth is not the engine in the early years, if the returns everyone celebrates are a rounding error next to the contributions, then the standard advice has been pointing every beginner at the wrong lever from the very first day. So if compounding isn't the engine in those first years, what is holding the whole thing up? The arithmetic just walked through gives an answer, but it hides inside the numbers unless someone points directly at it. So point at it. Set two savers side by side. Both open an account with $50. Both earn the same steady 7%. The only difference is a single decision neither one thinks matters much at the start. The first saver contributes $50 a month and never changes it. 5 years in, as already shown, they have moved about $3,050 of their own money, and the balance sits a little over $3,600. The second saver does one thing differently. They start at $50 a month, but every time a small raise arrives, they lift the contribution. $60 in year 2, $75 in year 3, $90 by year 5. Nothing dramatic. No windfall, no inheritance, no second job. Just a contribution that climbs with income, instead of freezing at the opening number. By the end of year 5, that second saver has contributed roughly $4,500, and the balance sits near $5,200. Same market, same 7%, same starting 50. The gap between them, over $1,500 after 5 years, was produced entirely by the contribution schedule. The return did not create a single dollar of that difference. Now hold the two accounts up against the return itself. Over those 5 years, the market's total contribution to the first saver's balance was around $600. The difference the second saver created by simply raising deposits was more than double that, without earning a single extra point of return. There it is in plain arithmetic. The lever is the contribution, not the rate, not the fund, not patience with the market. The one variable a beginner is trained to obsess over, which index, which platform, which allocation returns 0.5% more, moves the early balance by a few dollars. The variable nobody frames as investing at all, the boring act of putting more in and lifting it over time, moves it by hundreds, then thousands. This is why the historical winners looked like proof of compounding when they were really proof of inflow. Their contributions rose automatically, through raises and matches feeding a payroll deduction they never touched. The rising contribution saver above is doing by hand, badly and imperfectly, what the 1980s worker had done for them by structure. And that manual version still beats the frozen contribution version decisively, because the engine was never the market. The engine was the money going in, and how fast it grew. Sit with the discomfort in that for a moment, because it cuts against everything the encouraging graph implies. A beginner who spends a weekend researching the perfect low-cost fund, and then contributes $50 a month forever, has optimized the passenger and abandoned the engine. A beginner who picks a mediocre but cheap fund in 10 minutes and then relentlessly raises the contribution has done the opposite and comes out ahead by a margin that widens every single year. The lesson is not that returns never matter. They matter enormously later, once the balance is large enough that its own growth rivals a year of deposits. But later is decades to the right of where the near-zero starter stands. In the years actually being lived through, the return is noise and the contribution is signal. The advice has the two reversed. The answer to the question this block opened with is now on the table. The contribution rate is the engine in those first years. Full stop. The saver is the machine. The market is loose change from the back seat until the balance grows up. But the side-by-side comparison quietly assumes something generous, that every dollar contributed actually stays in the account and works. Run the same two savers again, and there is a line in the calculation that has not been named yet. A line that takes its share before the market ever gets its turn, and takes it hardest from exactly the smallest accounts. No beginner is warned about it. It is waiting in the next set of numbers. A 1% fee sounds like nothing. It is a single penny on a dollar, a rounding gesture, the kind of number a beginner nods past on the way to opening the account, but run it against a small balance instead of a large one, and it stops behaving like a small number. It behaves like a tax on the one thing the near-zero starter cannot afford to lose, the contributions doing all the early work. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth slowing down for because almost nobody explains why a percentage fee lands so unevenly. A fee stated as a percentage of assets scales perfectly with the balance. A fee stated as a flat dollar amount does not scale at all. And the small account is precisely where flat costs still lurk. The monthly account maintenance charge, the inactivity fee, the transfer fee, the fund minimum that forces a beginner into a pricier share class. These were negligible to the payroll-fed worker with a growing balance. To someone holding $600, they are enormous in percentage terms, because the denominator is tiny. Watch it in the numbers already on the table. Return the two savers to year one. The frozen contribution saver holds a balance that ends the year near $670, of which roughly $24 was growth. Now attach a $9 a month account fee, a real figure at some platforms for balances under a threshold. That is $108 a year. The market produced 24, the fee took 108. The account did not merely underperform, it went backward by $84. In a year, the saver did everything right. Sit with the asymmetry. The exact same $9 fee, attached to a $100,000 balance, is about 1/1000th of the account, invisible, irrelevant, gone before it registers. Attached to $600, it is more than 16% of the balance every year. The fee did not change. The account's ability to absorb it collapsed. This is the part the percentage framing hides. A cost that is trivial to the wealthy is confiscatory to the beginner, and it is the beginner who gets told fees are a rich person's worry. Now the percentage fees, which behave more gently but still cut against the small starter in a way the numbers make plain. Suppose two funds, one charging 0.05% a year, one charging 0.75%. On the frozen saver's early balance, the dollar difference is a few dollars a year, trivial, and this is why beginners are told the expense ratio barely matters at small balances. That advice is arithmetically true for a while, and it quietly trains a habit that becomes ruinous later, once the balance finally grows into the range where 0.7% means hundreds, then thousands, taken every year for decades. The honest statement about fees is two-sided, and both sides matter. Flat dollar fees are the immediate threat to the near-zero starter. They can, and do, outrun the entire year's return at low balances, turning a disciplined year into a loss. Percentage fees are the delayed threat, harmless now, disciplined later, but only if the beginner refuses to accept the high ones during the years they feel painless. The corrected instinct falls out of this cleanly. A beginner should hunt for accounts with no maintenance fee, no inactivity fee, no balance minimum that forces a costlier share class. Those are the costs that can actually eat the engine right now. And they should choose the lowest expense ratio available almost as reflex, not because it matters yet, but because the habit has to be set before the balance makes it matter. But notice what fees do and do not explain. They explain a leak, a real one, capable of running an early account backward. What they cannot explain is where the returns that do eventually appear actually come from. The fee is a subtraction. It answers where money leaves. It says nothing about the largest source of the growth that finally shows up. And that source is not the market either. The fee was a subtraction. It explains where money leaks out of a small account. It says nothing about where the growth that eventually appears actually comes from. And that source has a name, and it has been sitting inside every calculation in this video without being called out directly. Name it now. Return to the two savers one last time, but ask a different question, not how much they earned. How much of the final balance came from anything other than their own deposits? Over the first 5 years, the frozen saver contributed about $3,050 and ended near $3,600. Subtract the contributions from the balance and roughly $600 is left, the market's entire share of 5 years' work. The rising contribution saver contributed about $4,500 and ended near $5,200. The market's share of that account is only marginally larger. In both cases, over 80% of everything the account holds was put there by hand, dollar by dollar, by a person choosing to move money they could have spent. 80%. That is not compounding. That is behavior wearing compounding's clothes. And this is not just an inference from a composite. It is what the formal research keeps finding when it separates the two forces. Morningstar has published its Mind the Gap study annually for years, measuring the difference between the returns of fund reports and the returns its investors actually capture, a gap driven entirely by when people buy, sell, add, and stop. Across the decade ending in 2023, that behavior gap ran to roughly 1.1 percentage points per year of foregone return. The fund earned one thing, the humans in it earned meaningfully less because of what they did with the deposits. Sit with what that implies for the small starter. If seasoned investors with substantial balances forfeit over a full point a year purely to behavior, mistimed exits, paused contributions, panic in a downturn, then for someone whose entire account is built from behavior in the first place, behavior is not a footnote to the return. It is the return. There is almost nothing else in the account for the market to have produced. So consider how this reframes the beginner's actual job. The near-zero starter was handed a task described in the language of markets. Pick the fund, hold through volatility, trust the 7%. But the arithmetic and the research point at a task described in the language of behavior. Keep contributing when it feels pointless, raise the amount when income rises, and above all, do not stop and cash out during the years. The balance is too small to reward patience. Apply it plainly. The lever a beginner controls completely is the deposit. The lever a beginner controls not at all is the market's return in any given year. The standard advice trains attention on the uncontrollable variable and takes the controllable one for granted. The corrected instinct inverts that. Treat the contribution as the investment strategy, because in these years it literally is the strategy. The fund is just the container the behavior gets stored in. That is the answer the whole middle of this video was building toward. If compounding is not doing the work in the first years, the contribution is, and behind the contribution stands the one thing that decides whether the contribution keeps arriving. Not the platform, not the allocation, not the interest rate. The person's capacity to keep doing an unrewarding thing, on schedule, for years, before any of it visibly pays. Which means the hardest part of small-scale investing was never financial. Every calculation so far pointed one direction. The contribution is the engine, and behavior decides whether the contribution keeps arriving. But a fair examination has to test the thesis against the case that seems to break it. The small starter who did win, and who was not fed by any payroll deduction, any match, any inheritance quietly waiting in year 4. That person exists. Consider a composite, labeled plainly as a composite, assembled from a trajectory common enough to be worth naming. A man opens a Roth at 31 with a single $100 transfer. He has no employer plan. He is a contractor, paid irregularly, some months flush, some months thin. Nobody deducts anything for him. Nobody matches anything. For 9 years, the account grows on nothing but what he decides to move, by hand, in a life with no financial structure behind it. By year 9, the account holds a little over $40,000. By the arithmetic already established, that is not what compounding does to $100 in 9 years. Something else built it. Here is the emotional center of his story, because it is the part that gets left out of the highlight version. He did not enjoy those years. There was no swelling music. For the first 4 years, the account was so small that the growth, when it came, was invisible. A few dollars against deposits he genuinely felt. In a bad quarter, he wanted to stop. He came close, more than once, to pulling the balance to cover a slow month. The account was not a source of pride during those years. It was a monthly argument with himself that he kept, narrowly winning. So what made him different? Not the return. He earned roughly what everyone earns. Not the fund. He picked a cheap index fund in an afternoon and never touched it again. Not discipline in some heroic sense either. He described himself as bad with money. The turn is this. He had done one specific thing at the very start, before the first contribution, that the frozen saver never did. He had written down a single number, the amount he could move in his worst month, not his best, and he had automated exactly that number to transfer on the day work typically paid, whether or not he remembered, whether or not he felt like it. $50 in the lean months. When a good month came, he added on top by hand. But the floor never moved and never depended on his mood. That floor is the whole difference. The winning small starter did not out-invest the quitting small starter. He outstructured him. He manufactured, by himself, the one ingredient the payroll-fed workers of the 1980s were handed for free, an inflow that did not require a decision each time it happened. He removed the willpower from the part that had to survive the boring years and spent his willpower only on the extra in the months that could afford it. Look back at everyone this video has examined. The 1980s worker had automatic inflow through payroll. The composite woman who reached $300,000 had a rising, matched deduction she never had to summon. And now the contractor who started with $100 and no structure at all, the apparent counterexample, turns out to prove the same rule from the opposite side. He won not because he beat the odds of starting small, but because he built the missing structure with his own hands before the odds could act on him. The quitting starter and the surviving starter are not divided by income, intelligence, or fun choice. They are divided by whether the contribution depends on a decision that has to be remade, in a bad month, against every reason to skip it. That one difference is exactly where the corrected path has to begin. Watch a small account in month 31. The saver opened it, funded it, felt the quiet pride of finally beginning, and now the balance sits at $1,100. The growth for the whole year would not cover a dinner out, and the market has just given back 3 months of contributions in a single ugly week. Nothing has gone wrong. This is the plan working exactly as designed, and this is precisely the point at which most people walk away. Look at what the person is actually experiencing, because the number on the screen and the feeling in the chest have come completely apart. The arithmetic says, keep going. The flat years are the price of admission, the curve bends later. The feeling says, 2.5 years of sacrifice, and I have less than the cost of a used transmission, and it just went down. The advice never warned that the reward would be invisible for this long, so the absence of reward gets read as failure. Not the plan's failure, the person's. And people quit things that make them feel like failures. That is the cliff. It is not a moment of weakness. It is a structural feature of small balance investing. And it arrives on a schedule so predictable it could almost be printed on the account statement. Roughly years 2 through 5, at balances too small for growth to be felt, in a life where the contribution is still a real sacrifice made by hand. This is where the quitting happens, for the most rational reason imaginable. The person is being asked to keep paying for something that shows them no return they can see. Now set the two savers from earlier side by side, but measure something the earlier comparisons ignored, not their balances, but their exposure to the cliff. The frozen saver and the rising saver both hit year 3 with a balance whose growth is a rounding error. Both feel the same flatness. But watch the difference in what quitting costs each of them emotionally. The frozen saver has to decide, every single month, to move the $50. 36 separate decisions across 3 years, each one a fresh opportunity to skip, and each skip a small permission for the next. The rising saver who automated the floor has made that decision once. In the boring years, the frozen saver is running on willpower, and the automated saver is running on inertia, and inertia is the only one of the two that does not get tired. That is the insight hiding inside the everyday observation. The cliff is not survived by wanting it more, it is survived by needing to want it less. Every success case in this video, the payroll worker, the matched saver, the contractor with his lean month floor, crossed the cliff the same way. The contribution kept arriving during the years it felt pointless, because arriving had been detached from feeling. Expand that, because it reframes the entire problem. The standard advice treats the boring years as a test of character. Be patient, stay the course, trust the process. All of which quietly places the burden on the one resource guaranteed to run out under strain: the daily decision to do an unrewarding thing. Character is real, but character is a terrible load-bearing wall. It cracks in a bad month, and a bad month always comes. So the question stops being, how do I stay motivated across 5 flat years, which has no good answer, and becomes something narrower and far more solvable. How do you arrange the account in advance so that surviving the cliff requires almost no motivation at all? How do you make the boring years boring in the safe sense, automatic, unfelt, running underneath a life instead of demanding a monthly verdict from it? Because that is what the evidence keeps pointing at. Surviving that stretch turns out to be a design problem, not a willpower problem. Everyone wants the ladder first. Which account, which fund, which order to buy. But hand a near zero starter the ladder before the ground is level, and the ladder tips over in the first bad month, exactly the way it just did for the saver at the cliff. So the sequence does not begin with investing. It begins with removing the reasons a person cashes out. Start with the thing that ends more small accounts than any market crash. The emergency that has nowhere else to go. A saver with no cash buffer treats the brokerage account as the buffer. The transmission fails, the account gets drained, and 31 months of contributions reset to zero, not from panic, but from arithmetic necessity. Step 1 is not the market at all. It is a small, boring, separate cash reserve, even $500, parked where it cannot be invested and cannot be admired. Its entire job is to be the thing that gets spent instead of the account. It is not a return, it is a firewall around the return. Step 2 is the high-interest debt, and here the mechanism is decisive rather than motivational. A credit balance charging 22% is a guaranteed negative return no market can beat. Contributing to a fund earning a hopeful 7% while carrying a balance charging 22% is paying to move backward. The arithmetic is not close. Retiring that debt is the highest certainty return available to a beginner, and it is available today, with no fund selection required. Only now does the account open, and it opens in a specific order, for reasons the earlier numbers already proved. If an employer match exists, it comes first, because it is the single inflow that behaves like the 1980s workers' payroll structure: free, automatic, and larger than any expense ratio could ever cost. A match is not a return of a few percent. It is often 50 or 100% on the contributed dollar, instantly. Nothing else on the ladder competes. After the match, the tax-advantaged account, a Roth or traditional IRA, chosen not for its allocation but for its cost floor, no maintenance fee, no inactivity fee. No balance minimum forcing a costlier share class. The lowest cost broad index fund available, picked in an afternoon and left alone, because at this balance the fund is the container, not the engine. The hard thinking is now done, and it does not have to be redone. Here is the revelation that reorders everything. The sequence is not a list of financial products. It is a sequence of removed excuses. The cash buffer removes the reason to drain the account. The debt payoff removes the guaranteed loss. The match removes the doubt about whether it is worth it. And the automated floor, one number, the worst month number, set to transfer on payday whether the person remembers or not, removes the daily decision that the cliff was going to exploit. Notice what that sequence quietly accomplishes. Every step is completed once, in a clear-headed moment, and then it holds. The saver is not being asked to be disciplined for 5 years. They are being asked to make 4 or 5 good decisions in a single stretch of resolve, and then to let those decisions run underneath a life. The willpower gets spent up front, on setup, where it is abundant, not spread thin across 60 monthly verdicts, where it always runs out. That is the difference between the survivor and the quitter, expressed as a checklist instead of a character trait, not who wanted it more, who arranged in advance to need to want it less. But the sequence hides a catch, and it is the one worth ending on. Setting the structure once does not make the boring years disappear. It only decides how they will be met. The flat stretch still has to be lived through 3, 4, 5 years, where the growth is invisible and the sacrifice is real. The corrected path does not remove that stretch. It changes the terms of survival. And the sequence only works if those boring years are engineered from the start, not merely endured when they arrive. A saver in year 3 does not need more motivation. That is the mistake baked into every stay-the-course pep talk. What that saver needs is an account arranged so that staying requires no course to be actively held at all. The boring years are not survived by feeling. They are survived by design, and design can be done in advance once when resolve is cheap. Start with the least glamorous and most tested move. Make the contribution invisible. The composite contractor from earlier did not white-knuckle his way through 9 flat years. He moved his worst month number to auto-transfer on payday and then stopped watching it. The account stopped being a monthly verdict and became a background process, like rent, like a utility, like a thing that simply happens to income before it reaches the hands that would spend it. Behavioral economists have a plain name for why this works: the default effect. People overwhelmingly stay in whatever state requires no action. Automating the deposit doesn't make a person more disciplined. It makes inertia work for the account instead of against it. Second, stop checking the balance. This sounds like avoidance. It is the opposite. Consider what checking does during the flat years. It presents a number too small to feel good about, at a frequency high enough to feel bad about often. The Morningstar behavior gap, the return investors forfeit through their own timing, is fed largely by people watching accounts and reacting. For a near-zero starter, there is nothing to react to yet. The only thing frequent checking can produce is the discouragement that precedes quitting. A quarterly glance is plenty. Monthly is a temptation. Daily is self-harm dressed as diligence. Third, measure the right thing. The saver at the cliff is demoralized because they are measuring balance, the one number designed to stay flat for years. Change the metric. Track the contribution streak instead. Months in a row the deposit arrived. That number goes up every single month, regardless of the market, regardless of the balance, regardless of how invisible the growth is. It rewards the exact behavior that is actually building the account. A person who has moved money 41 months running has visible proof of the only thing that matters yet, and pride attached to the lever they control, not the one they don't. Consider how these 3 moves reshape the contractor's worst stretch. In a lean quarter, his deposit still fired automatically at the floor amount, so no decision was made in a weak moment. He wasn't watching the balance sink, so the sinking never entered his head as a reason to stop. And when he did glance, the number he saw climb was the streak: 44, 45, 46 months, a scoreboard that only ever went up. He did not outdiscipline the person who quit. He arranged, before the boring years began, to spend almost no discipline inside them. That is the whole answer to the question this act has circled. Can the reward-free stretch be engineered to be survivable? Yes, but only by accepting that the stretch itself cannot be shortened. The growth stays invisible for years no matter what anyone does. What can be built is a structure where survival no longer depends on wanting it, checking it, or feeling it. Automate the inflow so no decision is required. Look away so no reaction is provoked. Count the streak so the effort has a scoreboard the market cannot touch. The quitters were never weaker. They were simply asked to carry with willpower a thing that willpower was never built to hold for 5 years. The survivors set it down onto structure and walked beside it. Which finally answers the question this whole video opened on: why so many start small and stop, and why almost none of them ever had to. 2 people open identical accounts on the same day. Same $50, same fund, same 7%, same flat, unrewarding years ahead. 5 years later, one has an account that survived and one has a closed account and a story about how investing didn't really work out. Nothing separated their incomes. Nothing separated their intelligence, their fund choice, or their luck in the market. One had removed the moments where quitting could happen. The other had left every one of them standing. That is the whole video in a single image, and it answers the question held open since the first minute. If starting small always wins, if compounding really does the heavy lifting, why do most people who start small quit before it ever matters? Because the advice they were handed described a machine they were never given. Just start and let it compound was a true sentence for people whose starting was fused to an automatic, rising inflow. The payroll-fed worker of the 1980s. The matched saver, the account that grew whether or not anyone felt like feeding it. Strip away that inflow and hand the same 3 words to someone with nothing behind them but resolve, and the words stop describing a strategy. They become a request to perform willpower, monthly, for years, in exchange for a reward that stays invisible the entire time. People do not quit because they are weak. They quit because they were asked to carry something willpower was never built to hold. Here is the central truth stated plainly. In the years a near-zero starter actually lives through, compounding does almost nothing. Over 80% of a small account's early balance is put there by hand. The engine is the contribution. Behind the contribution stands the only thing that decides whether it keeps arriving. Not the fund, not the rate, not the platform, but whether the deposit was detached from a decision that has to be remade in a bad month. So unfold what that means for the person standing at zero right now. The task was never to pick the perfect index fund. It was to build, by hand, the structure the winners were handed for free. Firewall the account with a small cash buffer so the emergency has somewhere else to go. Retire the 22% debt that guarantees a loss no market can beat. Take the employer match if it exists, because nothing else returns 50 cents on the dollar instantly. Open the low-cost account, choose the cheap fund in an afternoon, and then automate the worst month number to transfer on payday whether or not the mood is there. Look away from the balance. Count the contribution streak instead, because that number climbs every month the market refuses to. None of that shortens the boring years. 3, 4, 5 flat years still have to be lived through. What the structure changes is the terms of survival. It moves the willpower to the front, where it is abundant, and lets inertia carry the rest. The quitters and the survivors were divided by one thing, and it was never character. It was whether the boring years were engineered before they arrived or merely endured when they did. That is the honest correction to just start. Start, yes, but start by removing the reasons you will stop. Wealth is built to last, and the small starter's real work is building the part that lasts before the growth ever shows up. This is education, not personalized advice.